this episode, we are going to be looking at our second focus for prayer, the baptism of the Holy Spirit for personal transformation. What we're doing for our prayer time to help guide us in this is to take a piece of paper and to divide it into 4 equal columns, each one being a separate prayer focus. Or if you like, you can get yourself a blank journal and make it your prayer journal, and there divide the pages into these 4 columns. Now, as we saw last time, the first column is entitled Death of the Sinful Nature. And the second prayer column that we're looking at in this episode is the baptism of the Holy Spirit for daily transformation. And in this column, we're going to keep notes of our focus for prayer as we're praying for the baptism of the Holy Spirit. Now, imagine your life is like this glass. As a human being without God, we are full of ourselves. We are full of our sinful natures. And this is why Paul tells us to become a living sacrifice and to put to death the sinful nature. Now, another way of describing the sinful nature being put to death or dying is to be emptied. So just as this cup has been filled, we're now going to pour it out. Now, why would we use this type of metaphor? Because in order to be filled with the Holy Spirit, we first need to be emptied of self. Listen to these 2 quotations about the emptying of the sinful nature. Unless the soul temple is daily emptied of self and prepared for the reception of the Holy Spirit, self will rule the entire being. And again, the soul must be emptied of self, that Christ may pour his Spirit into the vacuum. Emptied of self we must be, else we cannot show that Christ is formed within, the hope of glory. The preciousness and importance of truth must appear and will appear when self is hid with Christ in God. Then Jesus will be revealed in our lives. Our characters will be moulded after the divine similitude, that's the divine character. Then the Holy Spirit will control the human agent. Men will possess the attributes of Christ. So this emptying of the sinful nature, of the sinful self, is done so that we can be filled with the nature of Jesus Christ that comes as we are filled by the Holy Spirit. And that is the way that we accomplish God's ambition for us. As Paul says in Romans 8:29, that we be conformed to the image of his Son. We've been looking at this image of a cup being emptied and filled, emptied of self and being filled by the Holy Spirit. But now we're going to go back into the Old Testament to look at another symbol that is used for the filling of the Holy Spirit. Now, at the beginning of the tabernacle services, and then at the beginning of the temple services, something really important happened. Let me read you a couple of texts that come from the inauguration time of these 2 services. At the inauguration of the tabernacle, it says that fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed the burnt offerings and the fat portions on the altar. And again, at the start of the services in Solomon's temple, it says that when Solomon finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offerings and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. Now notice in both of these examples, at the beginning of these temple and tabernacle services, divine fire came out from heaven and consumed waiting sacrifices. Now, this divine fire was extremely important, so important that in Leviticus chapter 6, God repeats some instructions to the priests 3 times, where he says, "Don't let this fire go out." Give Aaron and his priests this command. These are the regulations of the burnt offering. The burnt offering is to remain on the altar hearth throughout the night, till morning, and the fire must be kept burning on the altar. The fire on the altar must be kept burning. It must not go out. The fire must be kept burning on the altar continuously. It must not go out. Now let's look at this image again of divine fire coming down out of heaven onto a sacrifice. But this time we're looking to the New Testament and the baptism of Jesus. Now, Matthew records it like this. He says that as soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. At that moment, heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. So here we have the same components. We have Jesus, who has just gone under the waters of Jordan, indicating that he has come as a sacrifice, or as Paul would say, a living sacrifice. And the moment that sacrifice has been laid out, if you like, divine fire, the fire of the Holy Spirit, comes out of heaven onto the sacrifice. Now, this picture of divine fire coming out of heaven onto Jesus, who has just offered himself as a sacrifice, was not just a one-off event. It was intended to be a daily process. Listen to this quotation. From the hours spent with God, Jesus came forth morning by morning to bring the light of heaven to men. Daily he received a fresh baptism of the Holy Spirit. In the early hours of the new day, the Lord awakened him from his slumbers, and his soul and his lips were anointed with grace. So just as Jesus every day presented himself to his Father as a sacrifice to be used in any way that the Father would like, so we are called to offer ourselves to God. Daily we are to make that commitment, that daily we may be filled with the Holy Spirit. Jesus declared that those who want to follow him should die daily. And Paul himself wrote about himself. He says, "I die daily." I think it's very significant that we see this same symbol at Pentecost. Here we have the disciples offering themselves as living sacrifices, humbling themselves before God, confessing their sin to each other. And as a consequence of that, the divine fire of God, the Holy Spirit, comes down out of heaven and consumes their lives. And from that moment, they are never the same people. Now, in this second prayer focus, we are looking at receiving the Holy Spirit, the baptism of the Holy Spirit. So, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians, we can become transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory. So in the first prayer focus, we've looked at humbling ourselves before God, emptying ourselves of self, the sinful self, that the Holy Spirit can take possession of our lives fully and transform us to be like Jesus. Now, in this time of prayer, the second prayer focus, I'm going to suggest that we focus on 3 different aspects of being filled by the Holy Spirit. Firstly, that we receive God's own nature in exchange for our own, which empowers both our mind, body, and spirit. Secondly, praying for faith for our physical and spiritual needs, because we cannot generate this faith by ourselves. It's something that we receive from God himself. And thirdly, praying for boldness to live according to God's words. So receiving God's nature, receiving faith, and receiving boldness to live according to God's words. These are all things that we need to receive from heaven. I would suggest to you that before the latter rain comes, this same process has to be operational in our own lives. Humbling ourselves before God, offering ourselves to God as a living sacrifice, confessing our sin, that the great outpouring of the Holy Spirit is going to fall into our lives because we have offered ourselves to God. Now let me make one thing very clear. The receiving of the Holy Spirit is not an intellectual exercise. It's not something theoretical. It is a genuinely real experience, something that happens to me in my life that changes who I am. But sometimes it's very easy for us to pray a quick prayer and rush out. But we rush out before we've actually received that Holy Spirit in his fullness as God desires for us. So if you remember the story of Jacob, Jacob had promises given to him by God, and there we see him wrestling with Jesus at night in the woods. And Jacob's prayer is, I will not let you go until you bless me. Now the thing was that Jacob had received the promise. He had, in one sense, the blessing. But what he did there that night was to hang on to God until he had received in his own experience confirmation that God was going to do just what he said. And I would suggest to you that is the same for us and the Holy Spirit. Every day we are offering ourselves to God as a living sacrifice, literally and in reality offering ourselves to God. But then we are also going to be on our knees praying for the real, genuine outpouring of the Holy Spirit. Something that when we walk out of the door and go into our office or continue our work around the home, the Holy Spirit is going to do things then that we could never have imagined, because we are now filled with the very nature of God.